Do you guys ever think that the self-proclaimed leading country of the free world is basically the only one in the world that is literally based on genocide? The removal from the collective consciousness of the systematic extermination of native North America is probably the hugest propaganda operation in human history. The first step, convincing us deep into our subconscious that before the arrival of white settlers on a mission for God, there was, inexplicably, essentially nothing in that whole continent. Their land is spacious and empty, they are few in number and they do nothing but run on the grass like foxes and wild beasts. They are not industrious and do not possess the faculties necessary to use the land or its products. Everything deteriorates and is wasted. Like the ancient patriarchs, it is lawful to take this land that no one uses and use it, a settler wrote in 1622. This should be asked, for example, to those who until then used to live quite peacefully along the shores of present-day California. The first person to encounter and describe that was the Portuguese explorer Juan Rodrigues Cabrillo in 1542. He spoke of densely populated areas and especially of beautiful valleys full of corn and food. In general, it can be said that the edible plants of the New World far exceeded in variety and effectiveness the crops that were available in Europe at the time of the discovery of America. The ancient Indians involved in plant breeding definitely did a good job. Beans, squash, and other vegetables, particularly corn, which in terms of yield and variety of use was vastly superior to any European crop, grew in fields that were so well kept that they looked like immense gardens instead of cultivated land. Much of the region was crisscrossed by communication route, and trade between the various tribes was flourishing. Some peoples, such as the Hohokam, had built an extensive and complex network of irrigation canals, by which they had managed to make an area of more than 30 square kilometers of desert very fertile. The Chacoas communities found between Colorado and New Mexico were highly urbanized, and urban centers were characterized by multi-story building complexes, such as the one of Pueblo Bonito, a single 4-story building consisting of about 800 rooms with dozens of common spaces. No other structure in the US housed so many people until the 19th century, when the huge apartment buildings of New York City were built. On the west coast of Florida, the Calusa had developed sophisticated fish culture techniques. A report of a Spanish missionary from the 16th century states that a chief's dwelling was large enough to accommodate 2,000 people without being overcrowded. Calusa society was highly stratified. Supreme leaders commanding a standing army of professional warriors directly ruled over dozens of cities and indirectly controlled many others through a system of tribute. Society was divided into nobles, common citizens, and slaves, mainly prisoners of war. Elsewhere, however, social and political organization was decidedly more democratic. According to many scholars, the Five-Nation Confederation of the Iroquois League, founded in the mid-15th century, was even a model for the Constitution of the United States. According to J.N.B. Hewitt, some of the ideas underlying the Five-Nation League were far too radical for even the most innovative framers of the American Constitution. It had to be more than 150 years before the white man accepted the women's suffrage that was a fundamental part of Indian government. Even today, there has been no abolition of capital punishment as the Iroquois had established, and legislation for the protection of children, essential to the Iroquois social structure, had to wait a century or more before it was recognized by the white man. The Jesuit Pierre Charlevoix was particularly impressed by the educational methods. Using violence toward a child was basically unconscionable. Some Indians, he pointed out, began to chastise their children, but this happens only among those who have converted to Christianity or settled in the colony. What struck him was that, despite this, the young adults appeared decidedly polite and respectful, even in the management of public affairs. Jean de Brebeuf, another Jesuit missionary, narrates his amazement at attending meetings of Indian leaders. One of the most extraordinary characteristics of behavior, he writes, is caution and restraint in speaking. During these assemblies, every proceeding is carried out with wisdom, raises missionary Pierre-François Charlevoix, a calmness and cognizance, but also an integrity that would have been the envy of the Athens' best days. Nothing is resolved hastily. The contrast between the regal manners of Indian chiefs and those of British rulers was particularly pronounced during this early phase of settlers' establishment in Virginia, because England was ruled by King Jacob I, who was known for his lack of personal cleanliness, for his vulgar way of speaking, and because he ate and drank everything, producing sounds like herds of boars. Native civilization fascinated so many. Benjamin Franklin complained because an Indian child who has grown up among us, who has learned our language and learned our customs, if he goes back among his own people, he will never want to return among us. But if a white man has been taken captive by the Indians when he was young and has lived with them, ransomed by his friends and treated with all possible tenderness to persuade him to remain among the English, in a short time he is disgusted with our manners and seizes the first opportunity to escape again. Thousands of Europeans have become Indians, while we do not have a single example of an aboriginal person who by choice has become European, wrote Hector de Crèvecoeur. Too bad it was never an obstacle to perpetrating the bloodiest massacres. In 1607, 104 English settlers landed in Jamestown in what is now Virginia, an area where the Powhatan chieftain, the tribe of Pocahontas, had managed to assemble 30 different tribes residing largely in eastern Virginia, called Tenacomacá, which means densely inhabited land. No man's land. In fact, at that time, they had already been violently decimated by contact with early explorers. It's the extermination caused by viruses and bacteria imported from Europe, which has often been used to give a fatal brush stroke to the extermination. Indeed, diseases have made more deaths than guns, but there has always been a happy partnership between the two. People also died from diseases because of the conditions imposed by deprivation, and then those who survived received the lead cure. Despite the decimation in 1607, there were still 15,000 Powhatans. By the end of the century, there were just over 500 left. They had not all been exterminated though. It's the Berkeley Doctrine, who has been the governor of Virginia for a long time. Berkeley's plan was to slaughter all adult males, but spare the women and children, who were to be sold as slaves instead. That way, the war of extermination would pay for itself, explains David Stannard, the author of American Holocaust, the text from which we extracted the bulk of the information in this video. In the meantime, the British also founded the colony of New England in the far north of the US East Coast, straddling the present-day states of Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Here's too, a good initial blow had been given with disease, which had led to the substantial extinction of entire tribes, such as the Patuxent. The last member of the tribe, known as Tisquantum, died in 1622. 2 years earlier, he had helped pilgrims landed in Plymouth not to starve, teaching them how to grow crops in that land unknown to them. He did not receive a great reward. Nevertheless, it was not enough, stresses Stannard. Some Indians survived, and they were the most unfortunate, like the 600 Pequots who were burned alive during a single ambush. In little more than an hour, the war was freed from 500 to 600 savages who swayed bore, exalted Puritan theologian Cotton Mather. The man who led the ambush was John Mason, who through his lucid madness as an unyielding exterminator later was rewarded with the role of lieutenant governor. They also used to sneak up on them because the natives usually had a somewhat different idea of warfare. As a native explained to a British settler in the 17th century, "You are inclined to live in peace. If we intend to fight you, we let you know and explain the reasons, and if you give us satisfactory answers, then we will not make war on you. And if you intend to declare war on us, you should let us know your intention and reasons. If we do not give you satisfactory answers, you can make war on us, otherwise you should not. Obviously, in our eyes, it is naivete, but maybe it is simply wisdom. As Ruth Benedict wrote, the lack of understanding they showed toward war was abysmal. The basis on which the idea of war is based did not exist in their culture. What is certain is that they paid dearly for it. In New Hampshire and parts of Vermont, the Western Abenaki tribe numbered about 12,000. A century after the arrival of the British, 250 remained. In Massachusetts, the Pocumtuck tribe had 18,000 members. 50 years later, they were 900 left. And it was already the second wave. The first one had been the one characterized by the spread of disease. Then the third wave came too. By the end of the century, the Norwich Walk people left were only 100 individuals. By 1726, they had been further reduced, 25. Even worse went to the Androscoggin people, who by the end of the century were down to 160. In 1726, there were 10. In Virginia, in general, there was a 93% decline of the indigenous population between 1685 and 1790, after there had already been a 95% reduction of the population in the previous century, which in its turn had followed the previous century's extermination due to diseases. In eastern South and North Carolina, the decline between 1685 and 1790 was 97%, in Louisiana 91%, and in Florida 88%, 2,000 individuals overall. In 1520 there were 700,000, summarizes Stannard. The final then total extermination of the tribes was knowingly engineered through the systematic extermination of women and children. But it wasn't over yet. Awaiting then was a fourth wave of extermination. It was the War of Independence. As much as the British had systematically perpetrated genocide, for the heroes of the War of Independence, it was not enough yet. In 1779, George Washington directed General Sullivan to attack the Iroquois and devastate all surrounding settlements. The country must not only be invaded, but destroyed. I urge you not to consider any peace offer before the total destructions of their settlements. 28 out of 30 towns of the Seneca people were totally wiped out, and the victorious troops enjoyed flaying the bodies of the victims from the hips down to make covers for boots or leggings. Jefferson, in 1807, instructed the Minister of War that all Indians resisting expansions meet the axe. In 1812, he reiterated the natives were to be extirpated from the lands or moved out of America's reach. As Stannard recalls, the same words proclaimed by a German head of state in 1939 and directed at European Jews would be engraved in the memory of man. However, he continues, because they were uttered by one of America's founding fathers, Southern slave owner and esteemed philosopher of liberty, they have been forgotten by so many historians who have celebrated Jefferson's wisdom and humanity for centuries. To feel the full impact of the fourth wave, the Cherokee had to wait until 1828, when Andrew Jackson was elected. The same man who had once written that the whole Cherokee nation should be frustrated, who had led several ambushes on peaceful encampments, and who boasted that he always kept the scalps of those he killed. As soon as he was appointed president, Georgia claimed possession of a huge portion of Cherokee territory, which they appealed to the Supreme Court. And they even won it. But by that time, settlers had established everywhere, and they managed to impose a treaty. However ridiculous, as Alexis de Tocqueville observed, it is impossible to destroy man with a greater respect for laws. After the treaty began what is called the Trail of Tears, and that is the deportation. I fought in the Civil War and saw men cut to pieces and slaughtered by the thousands, but the relocation of the Cherokee was the cruelest event I have ever witnessed, a colonel in the Confederated forces will declare. Of the 17,000 who left, less than half reached their destination. In 1863, in Colorado, a local newspaper, the Rocky Mountain News, launched an incendiary campaign urging the extermination of the Indians. They are a profligate, vagrant, brutal, and ungrateful race, and should be wiped off the face of the earth. It was only the first in a long series, until the casus belli that everyone had been waiting for showed up. As Stannard explains, a family of settlers was killed by a group of 90. No one cared about which 90 it was. The governor, however, issued an emergency measure. Spontaneous formation of regiments of armed citizens was authorized to kill any hostile Indians they found. In return, they could take possessions of all their property. In this atmosphere, Colonel Chivington led a battalion of as many as 700 heavily armed soldiers to one of the main remaining indigenous settlements. They found 600 people there. Only 35 were warriors. It was no accident. He had been told that the bulk would be out hunting. He also knew that there were essentially no weapons in the village. The government considered those Indians to be harmless unarmed prisoners of war, and the colonel was aware of that, Stannard explains. They were all mercilessly exterminated. It went down in history as the Sand Creek Massacre. All kinds of suffering had been inflicted on those people. They had skinned them, blown their brains out. The men used knives, disemboweled women, clubbed little boys, hit them on the head with rifles, beat them to death, mutilated their bodies in every sense, including women and 2- and 3-month-old babies, reports a testimony. According to President Theodore Roosevelt, it was a virtuous and beneficial undertaking like those accomplished on the frontier. In 1906, he was given Nobel Peace Prize. Same script in South Dakota. It is the Wounded Knee Massacre. 300 of 350 members of the village were slaughtered by cannon fire. The survivors were then chased into the woods and bludgeoned to death. Shortly before, the editor of the Aberdeen Saturday Pioneer, the leading local newspaper, had written, "The nobility of the Native Americans is extinct, and those few that are left are nothing more than yowling dogs that lick the hands that beat them. The whites, by the law of conquest, by the justice of civilization, are masters of the American continent, and the security of the frontier settlements can only be assured by the total annihilation of the few that remain." His name was Frank Baum. 10 years later, he became world famous for giving birth to the children's book The Amazing Wizard of Oz. Meanwhile, in California, leading the extermination were directly Franciscan missions. Actual concentration camps where 36% of the children who were interned died within 12 months and 3/4 died by puberty. They have been still luckier than those who were born in the missions. 93% did not reach the age of 10. In the facilities, as Stannard says, the space available was perhaps just barely more than that to which Africans captive in the holds of slave ships were forced. Of course, in such conditions, the diseases introduced by the Spaniards ran rampant violently, not least because they did not eat. The average caloric intake was about a third of that guaranteed to black slaves on plantations, despite the fact that the fields they worked gave away bumper crops. And so, by 1845, after about 80 years of mission history, the indigenous population of California had been reduced by 3/4. It hadn't been so bad for them. When the US government subsequently took over, it was the result of a campaign of total extermination of the natives, officially announced by the governor of California in 1851. A war is already underway, but it must continue until the Indians are extinct, he had declared. Over the next 8 years, the indigenous population fell from 85,000 to 35,000. Never had inferior races been weeded out like bad pennies in the garden of mankind through organic and conscious processes as quickly as today. This is inevitable and not without justification. Pity and compassion, says Nietzsche, are a disease today, and we are called upon to show ourselves above moral principles and clean up the world for the survival of those who are better suited because they are stronger. Stanley Hall is stating this, the leading US pedagogue of the 18th century. Rephrased, it is the same concept that celebrated Wall Street Journal columnist Christopher Hitchens reiterated in several editorials on the eve of Columbus Day, the great celebrations that in 1992 celebrated 500 years of extermination that began with the landing of Columbus in the Americas. He declared that it was undeniable that Native Americans had suffered unspeakable pains from the arrival of English settlers onward, but called those who complained about it ridiculous, self-loathing, ignorant, and unable to comprehend the simple fact that the massive destruction of more technologically backward people is the engine of history. These centuries of horror would instead be celebrated with great vigor and gusto, he said. The similarities with the extermination of the European Jews and Gypsies catch the eye. But there is one rather important difference. The one of the native North Americans was probably the only genocide to have fulfilled the purpose for which it was perpetrated. The Jews now have their own state, are a full part of the international community, their genocide is universally recognized and celebrated, and indeed is often used to silence any form of criticism of the substantial apartheid regime in place in Israel. The one of the Native Americans is not even by the Jews themselves. Benny Morris is a leading historian at the Ben Gurion University. A few years ago, he gave an interview to Haaretz newspaper. The title is indicative: Survival of the Strongest. In the interview, he uses the genocide of Native Americans to justify the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing carried out by the State of Israel to the detriment of 700,000 Palestinians in 1948. You can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. Even the great American democracy could not have been founded without the annihilation of the Indians, where the ultimate goal justifies all the cruelties committed to achieve it, he said. History is written by the victors, always. And so, the only real genocide that remains is that committed by those who then lost the war. Even the Nazis, as suggested by Benny Morris, pursued a supreme end which justified the annihilation of Jews, Gypsies, and others. In that case, however, fortunately, the Nazis lost, and today there is no equivalent of Hitchens celebrating the extermination of the Jews with great vigor and gusto. Indeed, rightly so, just questioning the Holocaust is a real crime. In the US, on the other hand, when word began to circulate that the Smithsonian Institution was considering whether to finally call the extermination of natives in North America genocide, a group of Republican representatives, led by Ted Stevens, threatened a congressional initiative to cut off its funding. The point is not symbolic recognitions. The point is that without those symbolic recognitions, discrimination continues and goes unpunished. In the late 40s, after almost 3 centuries of ethnic cleansing, and after the ghettoization of natives on reservations, the US embarked on a policy they called liquidation. Someone pointed out to them that it reminded them of the Nazis too closely, and so, as sincere Democrats, they took up the criticism and renamed it Termination. As Stannard says, we must admit that indeed the term is apt. The idea was in fact to put a definitive end, once and for all, to all that remained peculiarly Indian in Indian individuals, abolishing by law the tribes, and commandeering the remaining land. A veritable campaign of extermination, not directed at individuals, but at their existence as an ethnicity, culture, and organization. Between 1954 and 1966, over 100 tribes were eliminated and over 1.3 million acres of land requisitioned. Fortunately, the long season of civil rights battles that began in the late 1960s interrupted this further project of cultural genocide, but the problems are still all unresolved. There are currently 310 Native American reservations on US soil. They are mostly located in remote places with pitiful infrastructure, including drinking water. Some have also been used as radioactive waste dumps, such as the Navajo Reservation, where a quarter of the women have traces of radioactive substances in their bodies. The life expectancy of American Indians is 5.5 years lower than the national average, and health conditions are dire. The incidence of diabetes is 3.2 times the national average, those of chronic liver diseases 4.6 times, and the suicide rate is more than double. Poverty rate is over 25%. The white Americans does not reach 8%. A male Native American is 4 times more likely to be incarcerated than a white compatriot, 6 times if she is female. Let's just say that they would have enough homework to do before they could afford to go around the world lecturing about human rights. We have homework to do as well to become the first media outlet established in a semi-colonized Southern Europe country to finally give voice to even those whose stories don't coincide with the white cultural supremacist narrative. Help us invent ways to do it more and better. Join OTTOLINATV's fundraising campaign at GoFundMe and PayPal. And who does not adhere is Theodore Roosevelt.
OTTOLINATV, comunque vada, sarà successo.